33 currencies in Africa. 33 currencies. None of which is used to conclude transactions anywhere. I come to Addis Ababa, Ethiopia, and I show my shilling. They say, what is this? But let me show the dollar. Oh, this is it. Let me show the euro. This is it. 80% of transactions in Africa are concluded outside of the continent in dollars. So you may have the Central Bank or the Federal Bank of Ethiopia, or Mickey Mouse. You may have the Central Bank of Kenya, Mickey Mouse. You may have all these 54 central banks useless. Because we are not playing in the real league, we are playing in the small league. That is the state of the continent. So as you have the honor and privilege of serving in the government of Ethiopia, and as you think about integration, that is the continent in which you are now, weak. That is the state in which we are. I watched a woman from Nigeria who had been rescued from the Mediterranean around Lampedusa say, I will not go back to Africa. Even if I die in the Mediterranean, I'll try again and again. What is it that can make a human being say that I do not want to go back to my home? Because the natural instinct of a human being should be that you want to go home. It's because we are weak.
What if I told you that Africa is quietly walking away from the US dollar and almost nobody is talking about it? No announcements, no warnings, just silent meetings, sealed agreements, and new systems being tested behind closed doors. This isn't just about money, it's about power. For decades, America's strength has rested on the dollar. But now, African nations are experimenting with alternative payment systems, local currencies, and new trade alliances that don't go through Washington. If this shift keeps growing, the global balance of power could change faster than anyone expects. The real question is the dollar losing its grip?
The doors were closed. The microphones were off. The cameras were nowhere in sight. Yet the decision that could shake the foundation of the global financial system was already moving through silent halls of power. It didn't start with explosions or speeches. It started with signatures that never made headlines, meetings that never appeared on schedules, and phone calls that were never meant to be recorded. A quiet shift, a quiet rebellion. And at the center of it all was a message that global markets were not ready to hear. Africa was beginning to walk away from the US dollar. For over half a century, the dollar had functioned as more than a currency. It was a system of control. Nations imported, exported, borrowed, lent, and settled debts in dollars. Oil contracts, food supply chains, debt repayments, and development loans all flowed through the same financial bloodstream. Whoever controlled that bloodstream could slow it down, redirect it, or cut it off entirely. And now, slowly, deliberately, Africa was looking for a new heart. In dim boardrooms across major African capitals, officials began asking questions that were once considered dangerous. What if trade no longer required the dollar? What if African nations paid each other in their own currencies? What if the future of African money wasn't printed in Washington? These were not just economic questions. They were political weapons. Every time the United States used financial sanctions, froze reserves, or restricted access to global payment systems, the same fear spread through developing economies. Fear of dependence, fear of vulnerability, fear that at any moment, a nation's financial lifeline could be flicked off with a policy change thousands of miles away. African leaders were watching, and they were taking notes. The first moves were subtle. Small bilateral trade agreements began appearing between African countries that quietly excluded the dollar. A cocoa-exporting nation would be paid in a neighboring country's currency. A mineral-rich country would settle energy deals without converting to dollars first. Central banks started holding smaller dollar reserves and quietly exploring alternatives. Nothing loud, nothing obvious, but powerful. Behind closed doors, discussions about alternative payment systems intensified. Regional digital settlement networks were proposed, designed to operate beyond traditional Western-controlled financial rails. Banking infrastructure began to adapt. Training sessions were held for a future where the dollar would no longer be the gatekeeper. The world didn't notice. Or maybe it didn't want to. Then came the shadow of BRICS. The influence of the BRICS alliance started to stretch its reach deeper into African thinking. not as a formal takeover, but as a philosophy, multipolar finance. A world where no single country controlled the flow of money. A world where regional power centers replaced global dependency. Quiet proposals surfaced about shared reserve currencies, about commodity-backed financial instruments, about digital settlement platforms that couldn't be frozen by foreign governments. The tone of the meetings changed. Urgency entered the room. Trade alliances began shifting shape. Long-standing routes that once defaulted to dollar-based clearing systems started experimenting with direct currency swaps. Agricultural exports were priced differently. Energy deals began using regional financial intermediaries. Mineral rights contracts hinted at new settlement structures. The US dollar was still there, but it was no longer unchallenged. In Washington, the first warning signs showed up not in speeches, but in reports. Quiet memos that talked about reduced dollar exposure in emerging markets. Policy briefings that included new phrases, accelerated diversification, local currency trade frameworks, strategic de-dollarization risk. The word nobody wanted to say out loud was spreading. De-dollarization. The power of the dollar has never been about paper or numbers on a screen. It's been about trust backed by military, financial, and political force. Force that says, if you step outside the system, there will be consequences. But Africa had started calculating a different kind of risk. What if staying inside the system was becoming more dangerous? Behind closed doors in African financial ministries, maps covered tables. Not geographic maps, financial ones. Trade flows, currency dependencies, debt exposure, sanctions vulnerabilities. The math was no longer comforting. What they saw was simple. If the United States could freeze other countries' reserves, it could freeze theirs. If access to global payment networks could be weaponized, it could be turned off for them. If the dollar was control, then dependence was danger. And danger creates movements. Local currencies began to receive new political attention, not just as money, but as symbols. National identity printed on paper. Sovereignty in digits. Independence coded into financial systems. There were failures and setbacks. Inflation fears. Market instability. Investor anxiety. And still, the direction did not change. Meanwhile, alternative payment systems started being tested quietly. Digital clearing systems, regional settlement platforms, banking corridors that operated without traditional Western oversight. These weren't science fiction. They were prototypes. They were stress tests. They were rehearsals. In the background, global powers watched and leaned forward. China offered infrastructure for digital financial rails. Russia pushed narratives of monetary independence. Middle Eastern states signaled interest in non-dollar commodity trades. South American partners explored similar frameworks. The financial world started to feel unstable, not because it was collapsing, but because its rules were changing without permission. For the United States, the threat was not immediate collapse. It was something far more dangerous, slow irrelevance. If African trade no longer required dollars, demand would weaken. If reserves shifted away from dollars, leverage would shrink. If settlement systems bypassed American-controlled networks, visibility would fade. Superpower status isn't lost in a day. It leaks away quietly. Behind polished speeches and confident press conferences, tension crept into strategy rooms. The fear wasn't public revolt. It was silent exit. Countries wouldn't fight the system. They would walk away from it. Africa wasn't alone in this thinking. But Africa was becoming bold. New trade alliances began to feel different. Less about aid, more about partnerships. Less about dependency, more about leverage. Less about survival, more about strategy. Behind closed doors, African officials began coordinating in ways that didn't require Western approval. Currency swap agreements, local clearing networks, shared financial infrastructure. Every step reduced the dollar's reach. Every move tightened the room's tension. The global financial system started to resemble a battlefield you couldn't see. No tanks, no gunfire, only contracts, codes, screens, signatures, money moving differently, power moving quietly. Then came the messaging. Speeches started to include phrases like monetary sovereignty. Economic blueprints mentioned strategic autonomy. Trade unions emphasized currency independence. These were not accidents. These were warnings. But the real drama stayed hidden. In the rooms where decisions were actually made, the tone was colder. We can't stay vulnerable. We can't let our economies be controlled from outside. We need a system they can't switch off. The plans were not perfect, but they were real. Meanwhile, American financial institutions began to notice unfamiliar patterns. Less dollar volume in certain trades, more direct settlements between African and Asian markets, increased use of alternative financial messaging systems. The global machine was starting to act differently. This wasn't rebellion with flags and protests. This was rebellion with spreadsheets. And it was far more dangerous, because it was hard to stop. If you bomb a country, the world sees. If you sanction a government, headlines appear. But when a continent quietly adjusts how it moves money, the power shift happens silently. Until it's too late. The world's financial system had been designed for a unipolar reality, one where power flowed in one direction. Capital moved through predictable gates. Influence arrived prepackaged. That world was cracking. Behind the mystery and secrecy was a simple idea spreading across African strategy rooms. A country that controls its currency controls its destiny. A continent that controls its trade terms controls its future. And a region that no longer needs the dollar cannot be controlled by it. This is why this feels like a global financial thriller. Because it is. Every new trade agreement excluding the dollar is a scene behind closed doors. Every new clearing system is a quiet weapon. Every currency swap is a strategic maneuver. The battlefield is invisible, but the war is real. The United States is not losing in a dramatic collapse. It is watching a world slowly build escape routes. And escape routes are more dangerous than enemies. Because you can't sanction someone who doesn't need your system. You can't freeze money that doesn't pass through your networks. You can't threaten a lever that isn't there anymore. Africa's move away from the dollar is not a declaration of war. It's worse. It's a declaration of independence. And independence is contagious. Once one region proves it can reduce reliance, others begin to imagine it too. This is how global systems fall apart. Not with chaos, with quiet exits. So here is the real story. The story not told in press conferences or mainstream headlines. Behind closed doors, a financial war is already unfolding. Not with weapons, but with currencies. Not with armies, but with payment systems. Not with attacks, but with alternatives. Africa is preparing for a world where the dollar is optional. The United States is preparing for a world where it is no longer unavoidable. And somewhere between silent meetings and secret agreements, the future of global power is being rewritten. The only question left isn't whether the dollar's dominance will be challenged. It's whether anyone will notice when the system finally shifts. By the time the world wakes up, will the battle already be decided?